you well know, this is a series of talks on philosophical historiography. Now, the fact that the room is not filled with people and people waiting, it's not Barry's fault. It is that the field is just a very small, narrow, and philosophers like to do history of philosophy, I mean some of them, but when it comes to the historiography of philosophy, that's not that important. Anyway, so we've had 2 talks the last time, and then today is one by Barry Smith. Now, what could I say about Barry? There's a lot to be said, but there are a couple of things that I think are, 3 I think that would be very important to say, and that is that he's Mr. Ontology. I mean, there's no one in the world that has done more ontology and has promoted more the field and so forth than he has. In fact, he's so famous and so, so much in demand that he's now working for the army, I guess, and, very successfully. Now, if he can possibly get those people straightened out, that will be an enormous service to humanity. Okay, the second point is that I don't know whether to call him Dr. Ontology or Dr. Grants, because he's the philosopher that has received more money in grants than anybody else in the world. So whether that is a sign of, I'm not entirely sure. You have the connections or what? Anyway, the fact is that we are very happy for him and for us because he has been so successful. Incidentally, when he first came to Buffalo, he was longing for a $1 million grant from Austria. Remember those days? And that didn't pan out. But it was good that it didn't pan out because then he came here and then he was, voila, success. Not 1 million, that's peanuts. And, basically, the third thing I want to say is that actually, for a philosopher who is committed to doing hardcore philosophy and it's in many ways interested in the confluence of philosophy and science, Barry is a historian of philosophy. He has a very good book, an excellent book on the Austrian philosophy. If you haven't read it, you should look at it. And in addition to that, he has written things that have to do with philosophical historiography. Like, for example, he for a while was very much interested in the commentary tradition, which is a wonderful piece of work that he did there. So, anyway, I think that you know him very well, and therefore, welcome.
Thank you. So I will be referring at various points in the course of this lecture to resources which are online and which you can find at this website here. The reason why it's called the Philosophone will become clear very quickly. So for some years there has been a journal of biomedical semantics. And if you'd asked a biologist even 30 years ago whether he could make sense of the idea of biomedical semantics, then probably the answer would have been no. The very idea would seem absurd. But now this journal exists and there are hundreds of people around the world who do something which you might call biomedical semantics. Part of biomedical semantics, as understood by this journal, include biomedical ontology, which is something that I do. And the connection between ontology and semantics and biomedicine goes something like this. There is a huge amount of biomedical literature. This biomedical literature contains information about drugs, about diseases, about treatments, about environments. And people think that you can use this collection of papers, which are available online at this website called PubMed, as a source of new biological and medical information. In other words, you can mine the literature in order to discover information that you can use to identify potential new drugs or new treatments or new diseases. And this phenomenon of literature mining goes hand in hand with the phenomenon of data mining, and because the quantity of literature is so huge, both literature mining and data mining are computational processes. Now, one strategy for literature mining is to tag the literature. So you go through a journal article and you identify that the journal article is about proteins, and so you tag the journal article with the label or annotation protein. And then if it's about some specific protein, you tag the journal article, or even the specific sentence, or even the specific word with the label protein of type X. Now this is a whole industry now. It's called literature curation. There is an international society of biocurators. These are PhD biologists whose career consists in reading journal articles and tagging them. Now, if you're going to tag literature in a useful way, then everyone should use the same tags when they're talking about the same thing. And the controlled lists of tags are the core of what in the biological world is called an ontology. So an ontology is a controlled vocabulary for tagging literature and tagging data. And this is just a small fragment of the most successful of these bio-ontologies. And you can see that there are two kinds of relations connecting the terms which are used for tagging. One kind of relation is ISA. So cytokinesis is a cell division, which is a cellular physiological process. And then part of the M phase is a part of the cell cycle. So there are more relations in the gene ontology, but these are the primary ones. Gene ontology has something like 40,000 terms. And it's used by many professional curators to tag journal articles in which things like proteins are mentioned in connection with diseases or with other kinds of biological phenomena. The gene ontology is used to tag genomic data, and because it's used to tag many databases, it becomes a kind of switchboard which enables you to link information in one database with information in another database, and it enables you also to link corresponding assertions in literature to the references to the entities referred to in those assertions in the data. And now, because the ontology tags are organized hierarchically, and because they are computational artifacts, you can use the tagged data and literature and reasoners which work with the ontology tags in order to make inferences based upon the data and literature which you find when you tell your computer to go data mining. So this is a gigantic industry. It's most mature in the field of biology, but it's gradually being used also in areas like military intelligence. And it's a strategy to address what I believe is the most fundamental problem of the world of big data, which is that computer people who create big databases are anarchists. And they always create new labels and new codes and new terms to describe their data, which results in a waste of a lot of important information which could be harvested from those big data resources if people would just use properly built, high-quality ontologies, which is what we do in Buffalo. All right, so the coordinated tagging of literature and data allows discovery of literature and data. So if you know that you're interested in protein number 10, then you can use the ontology tag literature collection, which may contain millions of items, to find all the literature items which talk about protein number 10. You can do reasoning, as I've already said. You can integrate the data. You can find links between data which you've not hitherto been able to find. You can use the ontologies also to bring people in different disciplines together, because the same ontologies are used to tag data in different disciplines. So the gene ontology is species neutral, because it's used to tag data about any organism, whether it's a human being or a mouse or a fish or a yeast, but it's also discipline neutral. So it's used by people doing aging research, or by people doing cell biology, or by people doing genomics, or by people trying to find a cure for Alzheimer's disease. And now the approach is completely generic, so you can apply it not just in biology, not just in medicine, but in any field where there are large bodies of data or large bodies of literature, or both, which you would like to harvest, which you would like to see as resources for data and literature mining. Now, there is something called the Emotion Ontology, which was built in part in Buffalo, and this ontology is used to tag, for instance, novels, which, as I understand it, sometimes contain references to emotions. But it's so this is where you find the Emotion Ontology. There are something like 400 ontologies to be found at this bioportal link. They're all ontologies which have some connection with biology or medicine. They're not all very good, unfortunately, but some of them are good. And the Emotion Ontology contains terms for emotions. So serenity is a kind of happiness, euphoria is a kind of happiness, joy is a kind of happiness, and then there is despair. It contains references to types of appraisal, because on one very popular view, emotions go hand in hand with appraisal. So people appraise things and decide that they are hateful or fearful or pleasurable. And so there are various kinds of appraisal, including appraisal of causal intent, appraisal of social attention, appraisal of loss, and so forth. So we put these various different kinds of emotion-relevant appraisal into the emotion ontology. And then there are types of feeling which go hand in hand with emotions. So feeling restless, feeling weak, feeling alert, feeling energetic. And there are various types of physiological response to emotion, which I'm sure are also mentioned in novels, such as muscles becoming tense, or breathing at a slower rate, or blushing. Now, the Emotion Ontology was actually built primarily by an expert in chemistry informatics. And the reason for that, of course, is obvious. It's called alcohol. Or indeed any stimulant. And so we have used the Emotion Ontology in order to tag chemistry, literature in neurochemistry. So here you see the gene ontology, which has the term neurotransmitter receptor activity. We have happiness from the Emotion Ontology. We have neurotransmitter, which is a Kebi term. Kebi is the chemistry ontology. And then we have dopamine, which is a chemistry term, because dopamine is a chemical. So dopamine has the role of a neurotransmitter, and this role is realized in neurotransmitter receptor activity, and neurotransmitter receptor activity, as we all know, is a part of happiness. Trust me. And we could do love also, but time is short. Or we could study the way in which emotions play a role in various kinds of disorders. So there are emotional disorders, such as depression, for instance. And so we have depression, which is realized in a certain kind of sadness, which has a part, the down-regulation of the dopaminergic system, which is a gene ontology term. Now, this is the top level of the Emotion Ontology. At the top, we have basic formal ontology, which is the ontology which governs all the ontologies that we build in Buffalo. And then we have green terms here, which come from the mental functioning ontology, which include things like mental processes, cognitive representations. And then the red terms down at the bottom are the Emotion Ontology terms. So this will give you some idea of what an ontology looks like and how ontologies can extend downwards from other ontologies. And if you build them in this way, then it becomes easier to link the ontologies together because they all have a common top level, and therefore also easier to link the literature together or the data together, which are tagged using the ontologies. Now, we did this also for dancing. So there is this Digital Technology in the Humanities and the Arts book, and we have there a quotation from Adam Smith, who gives a definition of dancing. Or actually, it's a definition of a dancing step, and you can look at it in this chapter here, which was co-authored by him, and he is demonstrating a half cut, which is a kind of dance step, as defined by Adam Smith, who is no relation, by the way. This is a kind of dancing. It's I'm going to get this wrong, whatever I say, so I won't say anything. So this is a half cut. You can see that he's doing something with his leg, which is a short movement of one lower leg crossing the other leg with the foot pointing forward. Now, you could do that without being dancing. I think that's probably good English. You might be an epileptic, for instance, you jerk your leg. Or you might be a soccer player. And so the Shan-nos step is not that. The Shan-nos step is that in the context of somebody dancing Shan-nos and doing a half cut correctly. This is the foundation, the leg ontology from the foundational model of anatomy, in case anyone is interested. And this is an instance of left leg. Now, we have a huge amount of information about dancing in many museums and archives and libraries across the world. But how would you find, for instance, the very first reference to Shan-nos dancing? How would you find out where Shan-nos dancing was invented? Who were the first people who did it? You would have no way of doing that coherently. It would be experts maybe you could find who knew some of the story, but there would be a very difficult task even in finding experts. And Shan-nos dancing involves not just the choreography, but also the dress, even the religion, I guess, played a role. And it was related to precursors of various sorts. But that information too might be difficult to find. And it may be that the same precursors were also precursors of Appalachian square dances. Now, the UNESCO is very keen on safeguarding what they call the intangible cultural heritage, which includes all of these things: videos, choreography, dress patterns, music scores, but also the ability, the skill, or the capacity to perform the dances. So there's little point in maintaining all of those other things unless people actually can dance the Shan-nos dance. And so the UNESCO want to not just store these things, but store them in such a way that they can recreate them, that the things stored can be used to recreate the cultural phenomena that belong to the intangible cultural heritage. And so we proposed in this article that we build the dansome. And the dansome would be a collection of all the data we have relating to dance, all the literature, all the videos, all the paintings, all the old dresses that people have stored away, all the scores, all the music, and then we can build a dance ontology, and we combine the dance ontology with a music ontology, which we clearly need, a dress ontology, a body part ontology, which we already have, a body part movement ontology, which we do not have. The dance ontology would be a sub-ontology of the body part movement ontology, probably. and then the Emotion Ontology, which we do already have, and probably other things. And then we use all of those ontologies to annotate the danso, and then we can find the very first occasion when a Shannos left leg cut was performed. So this would create the empirical basis in a scientific manner for the history of dance. And now we're going to do the same thing for philosophy. So what is the philosophone? Well, if we had it, we don't have it yet, but we have bits of it. It would be a collection of all the data and all the literature which we have relating to people who were philosophers or were students of philosophy, publications, editions, translations, schools, movements, and so forth. Arguments, counter-arguments, evidence, nice scientific things that we should be dealing with when we do the history of philosophy in the West. Now, we have a lot of information about those things, at least, which is available to some degree in computer-accessible form. Most importantly, we have something called the philosophy family tree. Now, how many people in the room have heard of the philosophy family tree? 1.5. So this was created by a professor in the University of Texas called Josh. I've forgotten his second name. He created it as a student. I don't want to be rude to Josh, but my impression is that he doesn't really want to continue maintaining it because it's a huge monster. But it's fantastic. It's absolutely amazing. Now, it's a hierarchy of philosophers linked, philosophers' names, I should say, linked by just one link, namely, is the Doctor Vater of. You are allowed to have more than one Doctor Vater, which is a good thing for some people. It exists in 3 forms as a wiki, which you can still contribute to, although I haven't yet found out how you can correct errors. As an indented list, which we will see in a minute, and as a linked graph, which we will also see in a minute. The largest chain of links is the Leibniz lineage, which has 140,000 entries. So there are 140,000 grandchildren and great-grandchildren and so on of Leibniz. Now, you have to take that with a certain pinch of salt because it's not even clear that Leibniz was anybody's Doctor Vater. Because they didn't, the institution of dissertation supervision was not anchored in the way that it is anchored now in the sorts of university bureaucracy and rituals that we have today. So it doesn't extend further back than Leibniz, even though it should, of course, extend further back than Leibniz when it's completed. Now, from 1930 onwards, so before 1930 there was a lot of German stuff in there, but since then it's been primarily Anglo-Saxophone. So some non-Anglo-Saxon philosophers are in there, but they primarily are writing dissertations in English. Wie es sich gehört. I'm not going to explain that joke. So this is what it looks like as a wiki. And you can search, and you can find, if you're lucky, you can find your name. Don't laugh, you're. So this is the Leibniz lineage, which includes 140,000 people, as I said, including people like Alonzo Church and Euler and Bernoulli and Lagrange and Poisson, and then Christian Wolff and this German person here, and then some Austro-Polish philosophers, and then Chisholm, and then Peter Hare, who was one of the great Buffalo philosophers. So this is an important lineage. This is how it appears as a tabbed list, although, of course, it's much, much longer than that. This is the Menke lineage, which is probably the second most impressive lineage. Also very large. I didn't count the number of entries, but it includes people like Wittgenstein, well, no, I guess it does include Wittgenstein because but I didn't list him here. That was a Freudian slip. Freud, I think, is here too. But Carnap is here and David Hirschenoff is here. And then there's me. So I am in the Christian Hermann Weisse lineage, which is it's a pretty good lineage. Actually, I think I messed up here. So Russell can't be in both of these. So Russell is in here, and Wittgenstein is in here. And Cornel West is in here, for people who care. David Lewis is here. So this is quite an important lineage. And then there is the D'Alembert lineage, which is the piece of France which extends into the Francophone world, namely Toronto. Think about it. And here we find this gentleman, Monsieur Gracia. Don't laugh, because you're not actually here. They misspelled your name. They put you down as Garcia. And your Dr. Vater was, what's his name? It starts with an F. He was in Iowa for a long time. Anyway, I'll walk you through it later on. But that needs fixing, probably. But Joseph Owens is there. They got his name right. And Condillac and other such. So this is what it looks like as a linked graph. I may have the only surviving copy of this because Josh seems not to care. And it's not clear that it's useful. So what can you do with that? Well, you can. It's on my website. You will find a version of it which you can zoom into, and eventually you zoom to the good bits. So there is Brentano finally. But when you're back here, you can't really know anything about where Brentano lives, unless you have a very good visual imagination. But still. Now, there are one or two other places where you find similarly ambitious efforts to create histories of philosophy in the proper manner. So there is this really very good book on the sociology of philosophy. This is his map of the history of philosophy. And I'm only going to give you one taster. So this is the Cambridge Metaphysical Club, and there is a reference to the monists over there. But Paul Carus kept Peirce, or the Carus family kept Peirce alive by giving him charitable assistance when he was suffering from heroin withdrawal symptoms. So we'll go back to our question. We have the philosophome, or we have a large part of it in the form of the philosophy family tree. And we want to annotate the philosophome using an ontology so that we can use the philosophome in conjunction with the entirety of world philosophical literature, starting with the pre-Socratics. So there is a story. Someone said, why did the ancient Greeks always write in fragments? And the response was, the same reason that they always built ruins. Now, so this is the ISA relation. The ISA relation in the gene ontology, as in all the other ontologies, joins subtypes to types. And so the subtype is a child of the parent, and then the parent in turn is a child of the grandparent, and so on. So this is how the ontologies are organized in child-parent relations. Now, a good rule in building an ontology, in order to enable reasoners to reason about, for instance, information about cell division. If we know something about cell division, then we know that it holds of cytokinesis, because cytokinesis is a subtype of cell division. It is a cell division. So we want the ISA relation to be such that it satisfies this rule, which is an ontological traffic rule. Everything which is true of a parent term is also true of all the children. So everything which is true of a female body, for instance, is also true of a body. Everything which is true of a free lower limb is also true of a limb, and so on. So this is the ISA rule. Now there are various people who have attempted to build ontology-like artifacts in the philosophical world. And you can find all of them that I know of on the Philosophone website that I mentioned earlier. But what they usually do is they build indexes. Now, the index that you find at the back of a book looks a bit like an ontology, and if you printed it out in a graphical form, you could make it look a lot like an ontology. But it doesn't follow the ISA rule, typically. Indexes are built for non-ontological purposes. So this is if you put this forward as an ontology, where the indentation means parent-child, it would be a bad ontology, for what I hope are obvious reasons. So the reason why it would be a bad ontology is because it doesn't follow the ISA rule. It helps you to find things, but it doesn't help you to reason about the things that you find. Now, PhilPapers, which I think is a wonderful contribution to modernizing the way in which philosophers treat the information resources which are at their disposal, has a category list which is hierarchically organized. And I don't want to be rude, but if you're going to have a category list which is designed not to index a single item of literature, but to index all philosophical literature, then you need something better than an index in the old-fashioned sense that people have created. But this is actually, if anything, worse than an old-fashioned index. So, if rationalism is the a priori, that's one problem. Or a priori and a priority and necessity is the a priori. Note the use of and here. It means that this is about both the a priori and about necessity. Or the a priori, comma, misc, which means miscellaneous. What on earth does that mean, and how would it ever help anybody? Do you ever go looking for the a priori misc? Every term has a misc, which is a sign that some mistake was made. But then there are other problems with it. If you search for aging in PhilPapers, then this is what you get. You get brain aging. You also get feminism age. These are the only three things you get. This is also a typical phenomenon of PhilPapers. I
think they just have a bad search engine.
They have. It's a fantastic search engine compared to everything else. So don't say anything bad about PhilPapers. I would never do that. So it includes Searle, but the only thing that you can search for is Searle's biological naturalism. You can't search for Searle's contribution to speech activity. It includes taxonomy, but the only kind of taxonomy you're allowed to search for is psychiatric taxonomy. It includes institutions, but there are only two kinds of institutions: economics and racism. And it doesn't include individuality or individuation. It has lots of gaps. Even though there are publications on individuation, as I've heard. Now there is another thing called InPho, which was originally designed to be an ontology, a dynamic ontology, to deal with philosophy big data. And so it was put together in conjunction with the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and now with PhilPapers, actually. Unfortunately, they didn't know how to build an ontology. And I'm not sure anyone is using it. So it's probably harmless. So the idea was that they have a novel three-step semi-automated process for building an ontology. If anyone tells you they have an automated process for building an ontology, you tell them that they are lying. The idea is that they search the literature and then use natural language processing techniques to generate statistical hypotheses about the relationships among philosophically salient topics. I want to do something like that too. But in order to do something like that sensibly, you have to build your ontology very carefully, not by using pattern recognition, but by crafting the ontology so that it allows reasoning. If you build your ontology by using statistics, you won't be able to use the ontology itself to mine interesting relations using statistical pattern recognition. And we will see the results. So, this is the taxonomy. And you get the idea. It's a mixture of things. There's a lot of feminism about it, however, and some Chinese philosophy. And there is some Latin American and Iberian philosophy. But unfortunately, there is no data. Now, remember, this is an ontology which is supposed to have been generated dynamically by mining the literature. So every term in the ontology has to have something that the mining of which led to that term being added to the ontology. So this is impossible. But fortunately, they do nightly data mining. So we need to check every day whether they finally found the data that they should have found when they introduced the term in the first place. Or you can inform them. You can write to that email address. So I know the gentleman in question. He's a nice man. He's not a fool. But he thinks he can build an ontology by automated methods. Now, another important ontology traffic rule is that you shouldn't confuse and or. So earlier we had a priorism and necessity. That was fine because it was about a paper which mentioned both a priorism and necessity. But if you use and here, you're only going to get those things, and you mean and, you're only going to get things which are about both African and African American philosophy, which is a very small set of the literature. So they mean or. It doesn't sound so correct to say African or African American, but that's what they meant, and that's what they meant here. And that's what they would mean if they did. So Arabic or Islamic. The reason it doesn't sound so correct is because or suggests exclusive or. And of course there are many things which are both Arabic and Islamic. So this is a taxonomy again, and these are supposed to be types, taxon, taxa. You create a taxonomy out of types and subtypes. And the ones in blue have subtypes, which you expose if you click on the blue. So they haven't yet found any subtypes of Chinese philosophy. So ethics has the subtypes. Applied ethics, which seems fine. Applied ethics, it seems to me, is a subtype of ethics. But then another subtype of ethics is the history of ethics, which is wrong. The history of ethics is not a kind of ethics. It's a kind of history. But fortunately, they have no data. Anyway, they don't have any children. I suppose they have some data. So history of logic is not a logic, but according to the InPho, it is a logic. And that breaks the ISA rule again. Now, they do have an entry for Christian Hermann Weisse, who is the root of the Weisse lineage. So almost as important as Menke and Leibniz, not to mention D'Alembert. So what do we get for Weisse? Well, we get some related terms. Personal. They have individuals here, which I guess is sort of reassuring. They get dates. But we also get a link. It says Christian Hermann Weisse can be searched on PhilPapers. So I hit the link and nothing found. Now they have instances. If you're going to do if you're going to do ontology and you're going to be coherent, you need to distinguish between types and instances. So philosopher is a type and Plato is an instance. Now, InPho does not understand the distinction between instances and types. So for them, an instance of feminist philosophy is feminist perspectives on sex markets. Now that is not an instance, whatever it is. And then they have feminist perspectives on power. These are all instances of feminist philosophy. Some of them are philosophy, but none of them are instances. That's the problem. They're subtypes. Feminist social epistemology is a subtype of feminist philosophy. It's not an instance of feminist philosophy. And so another important ontology traffic rule is that you should not confuse instances. The instance of relation with the is-a relation. So capital city is a city, but Toronto is an instance of city. And they make the mistake of confusing is-a and instance of. Now, feminist philosophy has two subtypes, it says. Feminist interventions and methods in feminism. I don't think either of those are really subtypes of feminist philosophy, but remember, this is generated dynamically by mining the literature every night. And so, under feminist interventions, we have all of this. Now, there is one book which I found, which is Feminist Interventions in Politics and Something, which is actually listed on PhilPapers. But the other, these are more instances. Now they're instances, not of feminist philosophy, but of feminist interventions. But since feminist interventions is a child of feminist philosophy, they should all be instances of feminist philosophy, too. But there is no data. So I'm not going to lose. It can be searched on PhilPapers if you want to go check, but they couldn't find any data. All right, and then there is PhilOnto, which was built in Buffalo along with a French colleague with whom I worked in Germany for a time. So PhilOnto was designed to build an ontology of philosophy exactly for the purpose of annotating the philosophone. And we try and do a proper job. So we distinguish is an instance of course, but we have other relations. So member of is the relationship between a philosopher and the group to which he belongs. And subgroup of is the relationship between one group and another larger group. And then we have worked on, which is the relation between either a person or a group and a concept. And for those of you who have been to an ontology class that I teach at any stage, usually I have a fine of $1 for anyone who uses the word concept. But in the context of the history of philosophy, you're allowed to use the word concept because there are indeed philosophical concepts, and there is a scientific literature about philosophical concepts. Just as you're allowed to use the word if you're doing the psychology of conceptualization. But if you're doing ontology, you should not use the word because there is a lazy tendency in many schools of ontology to suppose that what ontologies are representing are concepts. And so the SNOMED, which is the systematized nomenclature for medicine ontology, has as its root node concept. And then further down you get diabetes. And so to cure diabetes, you better think better. Because diabetes is a concept. And that is a mistake. But I will relate another anecdote for Jorge's sake. The inventor of SNOMED, which is an amazingly comprehensive ontology, it used to be published in book form. Now it's much too large to be published in book form. And it was created by another Canadian of the Francophone persuasion, whose name I'm assuming he doesn't exist anymore, Roger Coté. And he came from Quebec. And he wanted to present the Pope with a copy of the 6 volumes of SNOMED. At that stage it had grown to 6 volumes. So he went to the Vatican. I understand that this is a true story. He went to the Vatican and gave the Pope SNOMED in 6 volumes, and the Pope looked at it and he said, "Do you realize that this spells demons backwards?" So a person can be active in a certain field, and we have a big ontology of philosophical fields, and a group can be active in a field. A concept can be in a field, and then a field can be a subfield of another field. And a philosophical entity, which is something like an argument or a work, can be in a field. And philosophy itself is the maximal field. So every field is a part of philosophy. Not a child of philosophy, but a part of philosophy, if you do this properly. This, can you read that? Is part of our very long but very shallow ontology of philosophical fields. So you have political philosophy as a subfield of applied philosophy, which is a subfield of philosophy. Philosophy of Shintoism is a subfield of something about here, which is a subfield of philosophy. Formal logic is a subfield of logic, which is a subfield of philosophy, and so on. And then we have more. Philosophy of architecture is a subfield of philosophy of the arts. Aesthetics of the performing arts is a subfield of philosophy of the performing arts, and then aesthetics of dance, which I guess should also belong to the ontology suite supporting the dance zone, is a subfield of the aesthetics of the performing arts. So now you know. And then we have to deal with geography, because there are not only groups and epochs, there are also groups which are geographically determined. That there are, for all I know, Toronto philosophers. You have to combine the epochs with the regions to get 3rd century European metaphysics, which is a parent of 3rd century Greek metaphysics, 3rd century before. It's itself a child of 3rd century metaphysics, which is a child of ancient metaphysics, which is a child of metaphysics. And everything here is either Europe or Greece, or it's geographically indeterminate. Unfortunately, we know that Greece is part of Europe, and we can use that to reason, where everything we know about European philosophy, I have to be careful here, everything we know about Greek philosophy can be added to our knowledge of European philosophy by the computer, for what that's worth. And then we have Plato. Plato is a member of the subgroup of metaphysicians which are active in the field of metaphysics, and Plato himself is therefore active in the field of metaphysics, and Plato worked on the third man argument. Plato is a member of the group of ancient Greek philosophers, and therefore also a member of the group ancient philosopher and a member of the group Greek philosopher. And Plato is also a member of the group of realists about forms. So what can we do with this? Well, we can now annotate the philosophy family tree. So we know that philosopher, which is a term in PhilOnto, we know that philosopher has instances. So this is, I'm trying to remember the name of your Doktorvater in the philosophy family tree. Vogelin, is it? Richard Vogelin? They think that you are a student of, well, this is Richard Vogelin here. Richard Vogelin, and that's you. Richard Vogelin is an instance of philosopher. And these are the subtypes of philosopher in PhilOnto. So the philosopher of history, aesthetician of literature, aesthetician of poetry is a kind of aesthetician of literature, who is a kind of philosopher of literature, who is a kind of philosopher of the humanities, and so on. And then we have kinds over here, and we have instances over here. So the kind is philosophical concept, and the instance is the concept of form. The kind is philosophical proposition, and the instance is forms exist. The kind is philosophical argument, the instance is third man argument. And so once we finish the philosophy family tree, we then need to create an argument family tree. All the arguments ever propounded in the philosophical literature need to be catalogued, and all the generation relations between arguments and precursors, and between arguments and authors, and between arguments and groups, and between arguments and fields need to be documented. So there are concepts, propositions, arguments, theories, and methods, and these are all examples of instances, and this is the way to do it properly. And then metaphysics is an instance of the type philosophical field. Plato is an instance of the type person. He's also an instance of the type philosopher, and so on. Now, in the future, and this is the future not of the history of philosophy, but the future of philosophy, as in other mature disciplines like chemistry, when you create keyword lists to go with your abstract to describe the content of your article, the keyword lists will have to come from a good philosophical ontology, so that you automatically have your ontology tagged by, you automatically have your article, your journal article tagged by appropriate ontology terms. And in some disciplines, they are experimenting with compulsory use of ontology terms from designated ontologies. The Nature Publishing Group has its own ontology chief who is responsible for creating semantically enhanced publishing of all nature publications. Now this is what the genome looks like. And then the question is, what is the ohm for philosophy? And the answer is, it's all of philosophical literature. And we don't want to create an index which only allows us to find a topic in a single work. We want to create an ontology which allows us to reason over all works, and allows us to link together different pieces of literature, to link one piece of literature to another, but also to link one piece of literature to another kind of information altogether. For instance, geographic information. Where was this literature created? Where was this group active? When was this group active? Now, there are some tools which can already be used for this work. So there is something called Harzing's Publish or Perish. How many people have heard of Harzing's Publish or... Oh, that's quite good. 3 people. How many people have heard of Google Scholar? Oh, that's much better. Harzing's is based on Google Scholar. It's a search engine for Google Scholar, which is more refined than what you would find by using Google Scholar all by itself. So if we want to find all the literature which mentions Gracia, this gentleman, and individuation simultaneously, then we can use Harzing in order to do that. And so this is what it looks like. You enter your search term, which may be an author's name, and you will find all the papers which, in this case, are authored by that person. And if you go for Immanuel Kant and racism, you find just 16 items. And even though you put you put I Kant in the author box, not all of these are authored by Kant. And then if you look for Francesc Eiximenis, is that correct? Eiximenis. Then you find 40 items. That's a lot. Yeah, your dissertation isn't here, as far as I could find out. And if you go for individuation and scholasticism, then you find 160 items, which is not very many. But then you do find this man, Gracia. And then you can also do individuation and scholasticism by year. Now, of course, this only gives you the earliest thing you have here is 1907, which is not very useful if you want to do the history of philosophy of the Middle Ages. And so what we need is to extend Google Scholar or some philosophical corpus search engine like Google Scholar back to the beginnings of time, back to the pre-Socratics, basically, or even earlier if we want to do earlier philosophical traditions. And then we could do a study of individuation and scholasticism and find out the very first time, or a study of individuation indeed, find out the very first time when a philosopher had the idea of individuation. And then we could build a concept family tree of how all subsequent references to individuation, to that concept, not to the word, but the concept, flowed from that first occurrence. And maybe there will be rediscoveries. And one of the really sad things about contemporary philosophy is the degree to which people rediscover the wheel. And given that we have Harzing, no one should ever be guilty of rediscovering an idea which has already been dealt with in the philosophical literature. So we had this picture here. Plato worked on the third man argument. So we need to annotate the philosophy family tree with information about what each philosopher worked on. So Plato is an instance of philosopher, and he worked on the third man argument. I'm just doing a little bit of this. You can all go away and do the rest. And these philosophers worked on modal realism, and for each philosophical concept, we could create new family trees, subtrees of the main family tree, showing how they linked to each other in relation to this philosophical concept. And for each philosophical field, we could do the same thing. So all of the people labeled here, and you can see clearly who they are, worked on feminist philosophy of science. And all the people here were left Hegelians. They were members of the group of left Hegelians. And then this is the family tree for each epoch. So all the people there worked during that particular century. And we can do the geography. So this is a really wonderful source book for doing what I just did for groups and topics, but now for the geographical locations. So this is Western philosophy of the 20th century. And you can see it cycled from Vienna through Cambridge to Cambridge, and from Cambridge to Chicago, and then to Berkeley. And then there's a little bit of Madrid and Mexico down there, and Sydney, and Los Angeles, I guess. Even Paris. But I'm not quite sure what's... Well, I guess Heidegger. The important bits are purple. So there are some resources on the web. This is a history of philosophy by year. So this is 20th century philosophy. It looks as if it's very thin. But that's because they want to do every single century on one page. There wasn't much in the middle. All right, now, you put all of this information, geographic, chronological, group, concept, person, field information together, and then you can do real history of philosophy. So I want to know all the papers on Getier's paradox which were published in this period and which also discuss Goldman's barn. Or I want a list of all the philosophical arguments formulated by Christian philosophers living in Baghdad in the 10th century. And I want to know which of those were original. And then I need to be able to search through all prior philosophers to find whether those arguments occurred earlier. And then the ones which were original probably were not known to be original because no one had asked that question before. So this is real scientific history of philosophy. Now, we have already some ontological resources for doing this in a really interesting way. So the really interesting thing to do would be to find out what the arguments are for given philosophical theses and what the evidence is, in other words. And so this is just an example of an ontology. It's a new ontology. I haven't examined it carefully. It's a new ontology which is designed to allow tracking of evidence in biological literature, but which could be applied equally well to the philosophical literature. And so this is part of it. So a proposition is expressed in an assertion, which is the output of an assertion process, which has an agent, and which is the output of an evidence line, which is supported by data, and the data is the output of the data generation process, and so on. And then, in order to solve the problem, we need money from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which already funded a project called the Big Mechanism Program, which is actually doing very similar things. It's taking journal articles, reading the journal articles, trying to infer the models of mechanisms which are referred to in those journal articles in order to do reasoning which will predict, explain, test, curate, and then we go round and round in circles, and even suggest revisions. Now, we can do this for philosophy. In fact, the Big Mechanism project, I know the person who's in charge of it. It could be applied if we had well-curated, easily available philosophical literature, corpora. We could apply this project to the history of philosophy. And then we can all retire. All right, that's the end.
Very good. Thank you very much. I bet you didn't expect that. Okay, Barry, do you want to field questions? Or?
I'm happy to field the questions. Yes. Yes. Jonathan?
So, you don't have slide numbers, so I don't know.
Oh, that's bad. So I should pay myself $1.
Right. So, I'm interested in the slide where you have the types and instances specifically in the PhilOnto.
Yep. 68?
No.
So I do have slide numbers on some of them, so it says 124 there, for what that's worth. The numbers are not quite... So I think it came here, somewhere around here.
What are the prospects of kind of integrating this with VFO, right? I don't know what kind of thing a philosophical entity is that, and whether
so if we look at the philosophical entities, arguments, theories, propositions as we treat them, we wouldn't use the word proposition now, concepts. So the first four, at least, would all be information artifacts.
Information artifacts?
Yeah. So information content entities in VFO terms. Yeah. And then methods I haven't thought about, but I...
what about fields?
I don't know what a field would be. But I guess it's something like a collection of theories. I don't know. I agree that is an interesting challenge.
One of the tricky things that I found in trying to think about this sort of thing is that it's really hard to put any of it, because of the nature of philosophy, it's really hard to put anything that's down in an ontology and give a definition without thereby taking sides in some debate.
Yes. Yes. So you are addressing in a friendly way what I had assumed would be an aggressive counter thrust to the whole project. So in order to build an ontology, you need to accept certain philosophical principles, which then form the basis of the architecture of the ontology. And someone might say that by accepting those philosophical principles, you are already prejudicing the history of philosophy, which will result from using the ontologically annotated corpus to do historical research. Now, many of the philosophical principles that we accept and which are needed to build ontologies in what I think and other people think is a coherent way are in fact quite neutral. So the idea, the ISA principle, I think, is quite neutral. And I think that the necessity of distinguishing between types and instances is quite neutral, but a nominalist would perhaps types object to that. A nominalist might say that everything is an instance. Now, I think that we can still read the results in a nominalistically acceptable way, because we could just accept that the types are collections or sums of instances. So they're still instances, they're just very large ones. But when we distinguish between fields, for instance, philosophical fields and philosophical theories, let's say, then in order to make that distinction in a coherent way, we're going to have to have more contentious philosophical machinery to work with. And at that point, we're going to end up colliding with other people's views about how the history of philosophy should be done. So people who see philosophy as an expression of a class struggle kind of process, so that you get different kinds of philosophy in different stages in the history of the proletariat, would probably not be comfortable with a bland, neutral ontology like this one.
So, although if you could say that given an ontology like this, if you're interested in that kind of interpretation of the history of philosophy, you can still use the philosophism, as you call it, that's annotated with this to kind of get the kind of data that you would want to...
Okay, the issue would be whether the data was not somehow pre-infected. But I think that this is a reasonable objection. Every philosophical concept is contested by somebody. There are some philosophical concepts which go into building this machinery, and so it cannot be assumed that it will be entirely neutral. I think it is neutral, as I think you think it's neutral, but you can't assume that without thinking through all the various possible objections.
Neutral, but I think translations are available as long as you're aware of the physics in which it's not neutral.
Okay, neutral or trivially mappable to some other perspective.
Yeah, I have a good point.
Can an instance belong to different types?
So certainly every instance of a child is also an instance of the parent. So every term in the branch of an ontology will be such that the instances of the lowest child will be instances of the highest parent.
Okay.
But now you're talking about types which are not in the same branch. Some people think that there are cases of that, but I'm interested in hearing what your candidate case might be.
So I think there are cases.
For what's your best shot?
Can be an instance of continental philosophy.
So that's why I was very careful to put Plato as an instance of person. So Plato is an instance of person who worked on whatever he worked on, I've forgotten. And he was a member of the group of German idealist persons, philosophers. But I don't think he was an instance of any type which is orthogonal to person. He wasn't an instance of philosopher because he wasn't a philosopher when he was a child. And he did exist when he was a child, and I think it's a good rule that if you are an instance of X, then you will be an instance of X whenever you exist. You want another shot? Jorge?
Yeah, the question is, it's possible to have different ontologies.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yes, okay. So, that's the case. Then on what basis do you choose one over By the way, I'm sympathetic to the whole thing. I'll tell you what I
Okay,
think
so are you talking about ontologies for the purpose of doing the history of philosophy, or are you talking about ontologies for any scientifically acceptable purpose?
on the history of philosophy.
Okay, so I have been working on ontology now for many years, and I have learned what works and what doesn't work, and I've become very practical. And so most of my reasons for building ontologies this way have to do with avoiding common errors and making life easy for people who need to craft definitions. And to work with available tools, because the software is what gives us the power to actually do useful things. When I first, so I worked, as you know, on the history of ontology for a long time and on philosophical ontology for a long time. And when I first realized that there was the possibility of applying ontology to real scientific problems, I became very enthusiastic about the idea that ontology within philosophy might become an empirical discipline. So you would have the Smith ontology of biology, and you would have the Gracia ontology of biology. And then we would have an empirical test of which ontology, and therefore also which ontological method was best, by seeing which of those two ontologies would be embraced by the most biological scientists. And I would win. And that would prove that the Smith way of doing ontology was philosophically better than the Gracia way. Now, I was very enthusiastic about this idea, and so I went to the APA and various other venues, and I gave talks saying, this is how we make ontology into an empirical science. And I got absolutely no response. I didn't even get a negative response. It was just blank stares. And so I just gave up. And that's one of the main reasons why I then gave a talk here in Buffalo called Why I Am No Longer a Philosopher in 2005. I think it was April the 17th or something. And I didn't have an abstract. I had a big, gleaming metal, gigantic ocean liner, which was sailing out of this old medieval port full of scruffy old buildings and going out gleaming, and it was called HMS Ontology. And only later did someone point out to me that the ship was actually going backwards.
But the thing is, and you have to bring science in order to have an empirical situation. I mean
yes, that would be the empirical setup. Yeah.
And you know that philosophers are very averse at that. They think that these decisions. I mean, that if you're in the realm of empirical data, then you're really not a philosopher. You just put
that was another reason why I decided that I should give a talk called Why I Am No Longer a Philosopher.
Well, my point is, couldn't you answer something like this? Okay, so you have different ontologies about a particular topic. So what's wrong with having different ontologies? Because the different ontologies would probably come out because of some goal or purpose that is one thing. And then what you have is, let's say, two different ontologies, and one ontology would come out different to the other because the purpose of one was whatever, and the purpose of the other one was something else. So you look at both of them, and then you say, okay, if I'm interested in this seems to work better, or the results come out this way. And if I'm interested in the other one, it will come out differently. It may be that there is no resolution. And I would say, well, it doesn't matter because you have the goal of the end, which is what you're pursuing. And if it works for that, and this one works for something else. Maybe you're missing something, because all of this is predicated on the right input.
Yeah. Okay, so there are many things to be said in response to that. First of all, you yourself, in using the terminology of goals or purposes, are becoming a kind of empirically minded philosopher. So philosophers should be seeking truth for its own sake, I would hope. So when I started doing the ontology of biology and medicine, I looked at the various existing ontologies, because I was not by any means the first person to try and do this. I came in very early. So the gene ontology was invented or created or initiated in 1998. And I started working on biomedical ontology in 2002. And I looked at the gene ontology. I knew it was a very successful ontology. And I sort of understood the reasons for that, even though I was still very ignorant of the world of biomedical informatics at that time. I looked at the gene ontology and I realized it was full of logical mistakes, and that it could be better if I fixed the logical mistakes. And they allowed me to help them fix the logical mistakes. And that was the beginning of my starting to have an influence on the world of biomedical ontology. Now, the gene ontology was created to solve the following problem. You have these gigantic genome sequence databases, and you want to use them to help you understand the cardiac muscle development. How do heart muscles develop in infants in different species? And you know that there are various genes involved, and that these genes create various proteins, and the processes of creating these affects the development of the heart muscle, and if there's something wrong with the genes, then there will be something wrong with the heart, which will be a problem later. So they had a very specific purpose in mind. We will create a terminology which for things like cardiac muscle development, which will be species neutral, so that we can do experiments on mouse cardiac muscle development and draw conclusions for human cardiac muscle development by tagging the gene sequence data and the protein sequence data with the gene ontology terms. And it was a fantastic idea, very successful, and it's now used by many, many different kinds of researchers doing many different kinds of research. It has had hundreds of millions of dollars invested in using the gene ontology to curate literature. But what they discovered was that the original goal of the gene ontology, which you think is so important, it was actually not the primary use of the gene ontology. The primary uses, there are many uses of the gene ontology, and some of them are now more important than the original use. And so that means that within the world of the gene ontology, they don't think that you should build an ontology because you have a specific purpose in mind. You should build the ontology to capture the biology. In other words, truth for its own sake. And if you do that well, then you will have an ontology which can serve many purposes, most of which you will not foresee when you're building the ontology. And so I have had many people within the community of ontologists, and I play a certain role in that community, who have made exactly the argument you just made. You think you have these wonderful ontologies, Smith, but your ontologies are only good for certain purposes, and my ontology is good for my purpose. So the mouse people and the rat people build their ontologies which don't conform to the BFO kind of strategy. Other people do conform to the BFO kind of strategy, but the rats and the mice, they think they need a different ontology. Now, I don't want to say bad things about mouse people and rat people, but their ontologies are just bad. It's not that they work really well for mouse data. It's that they're just not very well built, but they don't want to give them up because they think that they need a special ontology for rats.
So the important thing for you are the rules.
Yes. Yes, and people have to follow the rules so that they do coordinated ontology development so that the ontologies work well when you try and link them together, which is what you will have to do in the end.
So one thing about belonging to different kinds and opposite kinds can be that some philosophers change their mind, and so they can belong to realists and nominalists. And so one problem would be that you have to index the philosopher to a certain group of persons.
Yes. So we don't index the instance of relation. We index the worked on relation. So let me find the list of relations. Yeah. So I guess there is a relation which we haven't got here, which is something like believes in or advocates, or I guess you would get that through group in part. But Kant didn't work on whatever it was for his whole life. He worked on some things for some periods and some things for other periods. So the worked on relation would have to be indexed by phase of the life of Kant.
Although it's different working on a concept and supporting a certain.
Yeah, so I think we have another relation for supporting or advocating, but if we don't, then we can add it, and we would need to add it. Yes.
I'd like to take a stab at an answer to Dr. Grassi's question about multiple ontologies. I would say that the considerations that you raised are kind of essentially pragmatic considerations, right? That you want an ontology. If you want an ontology for one kind of purpose, you might develop it along certain lines, and if you want it for another type of purpose, you might develop it along other lines. The problem is that the purpose for which we want the ontology is actually inconsistent with accepting, like it's bad for what we want the ontologies for there to be other ontologies, right? In this way, that so suppose there's multiple ontologies, and someone goes to do some annotation of some kind, or write a wiki entry or an article using these terms. Which ontology terms are they going to use, right? For my purposes, I need them to be using mine, right? I need as many people to use my ontology to annotate this as possible, to annotate these things as possible, so that when I use my ontology to look to kind of like get information, I get as much as possible. But if they have multiple options and they pick a different one, suddenly I'm just missing that, like all the information I'm going to have from that, right? So the purpose for which I think Barry is suggesting this would be useful is itself kind of inconsistent with the being permissive of other ontologies.
Yeah. And one of the reasons for the success of the gene ontology is that the gene ontology was successful at the beginning, and it became a monopoly ontology for a certain subfamily of annotations of data. And so more and more people used it, it became more and more valuable, and there was a snowball effect. And if we'd had 3 or 4 gene ontologies at the beginning, then we probably would never have had the successes that we have had, because we only had one. And I don't think that I don't think it's too late to create one good ontology of a maximally neutral sort along the lines suggested here, in order to annotate the literature of philosophy. Yep.
So I think this might speak to Dr. Grassi's question a little bit as well. So it seems like in a lot of the ontologies that we look at building, there's at least relatively easy mechanism for settling disputes, right? So we let scientists figure out what's the real truth of some cell structures.
Yeah.
But that seems like that's not always going to be easily the case in something like philosophy, where there might be interpretive disputes about the philosopher, or about which text is the best translation, or XYZ number of interpretive issues.
Yep.
So.
Or whether this work is really about individuation in the same sense of the term individuation as this work.
So I guess is there some sort of mechanism you're imagining for settling that kind of dispute?
In the long run, I hope that we can make progress even in addressing those kinds of cases. But one of the things that we've learned from the history of ontology since the gene ontology is that ontology can have a powerful beneficial effect, even if it's only partial. So one of our traffic rules is the principle of low-hanging fruit. Your ontology should deal with all the easy questions first and postpone the difficult questions until the latest possible date, until you really need to address them. I think we could get a long way, given that we have almost nothing at this stage, we could get a long way just by dealing with the easy questions. So if someone writes a book on individuation in Michenes? Eichimenes?
No, I didn't do that.
No, but if someone did, then we know that it's about Eichimenes, and we know that it's about individuation in some sense, and we know that it's by him. So we already know quite a few things. We know what years Eichimenes lives and what lived in, what language he used, what group he belonged to. So we can already do a lot of cataloging. Wikipedia probably has done some of this. And that there are people who know how to use Wikipedia in order to mine data of this sort, but no one has created the philosophical equivalent of the semantic wiki. And that there are grants to be had in what they call digital humanities. And I don't think that InPho did the job in the right way, but they certainly didn't do all of it. So there is still a lot of work to be done in transforming the history of philosophy into a scientific discipline. And of course my goal is to transform philosophy into a scientific discipline, which would be the next step then. Because we would get the DARPA big mechanism initiative and apply it not just to finding out how concepts matured through time, but also finding out which arguments are the good ones and which propositions we should be believing in. And then we just throw out all the other stuff.
So if we go back to the initial question that Jonathan raised, so as I understood it, there's going to be a problem of how we define philosophy.
Yes.
And that's going to be some sort of discriminative pathway into will we include this in this ontology or not?
So again, we take the principle of low-hanging fruit, and we have to define the terms we use in the ontology. But we don't have to define all of them. There will be some terms which we can leave as primitives.
Okay.
And I think we could leave the term philosophy as primitive because we're going to have the philosophy family tree, which will create a ray extension for the class of philosophy. And with the philosophy family tree is something that we find as a ground truth before we start.
I mean, I was just thinking that, in the end, what you're really doing is probably more like making a history of ideas, basically. And it seems like philosophy is not really doing anything work.
So one of the problems which we faced in the world of biological ontology is that, for instance, we have an ontology called OBI, which is the ontology for biomedical investigations, which is about things like protocols, equipment, samples, inputs, outputs, measurements, statistics, and so on. And nearly all of it could be applied just as well to physics or to sociology experiments. And so where do you draw the line around the ontology that you want to build? And that question I just don't care about, just as I don't care about any questions having to do with thresholds for vague phenomena. So who are the tall people in this room? Let's have them all stand over there. I don't care about such questions. John?
I'm curious about, so for one, I'm very enthusiastic about applying the PhilOnto and the ontology method to arguments, but it's not obvious to me how we go about categorizing arguments. I know you didn't mention much about it, but could you elaborate?
So if we go back to so evidence line here, I think that there is something no, it's not here, but if we go back to the DARPA's big mechanism program, so the person who is running this program, he is a computational biologist and computational linguist who is interested in logic. And he has exactly the idea that we can capture arguments logically and use the logical structures of the arguments in order to make links between journal articles and between assertions in journal articles, that this journal article supports this assertion in this journal article because this journal article contains data and this journal article contains an argument that this data implies this conclusion. So he wants to connect all those threads in order to be able to assign evidence scores actually to particular assertions in journals. And he would assign evidence scores on the basis of the arguments and the data. And he is making progress. It's, as you can imagine, it's a really hard problem, but he is making progress. So I am optimistic that we can do something. There is also some parallel work in the field of legal ontology, where people are trying to analyze legal arguments and create an ontology of argument types within legal contexts. And I think we can perhaps benefit from some of that work. And there, of course, it's sometimes a matter of life and death whether you have good arguments.
Now, these, is there someone else?
No?
When you're a historian and you're doing history of philosophy, okay, so you want to do something about someone's views on individuation and so on. Now, my take on this is not far from what you are arguing. In fact, it would be useful to integrate some of what you say, because my view was that you had to figure out the problem that you had, the terminology that you're using, the connections between all of these things, and so on. In order for you to be able to talk about someone's view of this,
Yeah, exactly.
otherwise you're lost.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And it seems to me that the ontology would be kind of a part of this kind of.
The ontology would provide you with the resources to do exactly what you just said. It's not going to be easy. So the ontology will not make your life as a historian trying to situate the relationships between these arguments and these concepts.
Right.
It won't make that task any easier, but it will mean that the results of your work will not cause similar problems for the next generation.
Right.
So the idea is that if we have an ontologically well-structured language, then we will convert what is at the moment beastly hermeneutics into something which can be carried out without black arts playing a role.
Well, of course, if we eliminate all the black arts, then we won't have any jobs.
So
I'm not sure that this person is the persona that we should encourage.
So
Sorry.
no, the goal is that everything that people do should be done by a computer. No, not because we want to take people's jobs away, but because if we can get what people do to be so rigorous as a computer would do if they could do it, then they're more likely to do it well. So doctors are often engaging in black arts just because they don't know what they're supposed to do next. And so we want to have a more rigorous understanding of what they should be doing, and then they can do it more adequately. That's the goal I have in mind. Yes, Jonathan.
I have a higher level question. So last week, about this essentially the view into the history of philosophy. Last week we had a speaker who pointed to this series of figures in the history of philosophy whom he called revolutionaries, right? And these are people who say, I'm totally transforming philosophy. After me,
Yep.
the whole history of philosophy will be basically irrelevant.
Yeah.
Philosophy is going to be something completely different, right? That sounds like the kind of thing that you were saying, right? That you want philosophy to now be, you're like the same way that.
Oh, no.
Metaphysics on the security
No.
of the
You have to listen. I
You're-
didn't say that I am going to transform philosophy,
But-
nor did I even
but
say
you
that
said-
I want to transform philosophy. What I said was that in the far distant future, when the history of philosophy has become organized properly in a scientific way, then the next step, of course, will be to transform philosophy itself.
Right, but it's the same. You're not the first to have suggested something along these lines.
I've done enough history of philosophy to know that many people who claim that they have revolutionized philosophy are in fact followers of some long-forgotten metaphysician that has in fact been seeding their thought, all unbeknownst.
You're about time.
Yeah,
Then
this-
it's about us.
yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. This was